The following documentary is dedicated to the heroes of a formidable army, an army of Indian prisoners of war and civilians who fought a courageous battle against British colonial rule during the Second World War. Outnumbered and outgunned on the battlefield, the Indian National Army, or INA as it was called, was defeated and forced to surrender. At the conclusion of the war, some of the captured INA soldiers were brought to trial on treason charges. When news of the trial reached other Indians, there was nationwide discontent, and even worse for the British, mutiny broke out in the Royal Indian Navy in February 1946. The Navy mutiny was followed up by another among the ground crew in the Royal Indian Air Force. In the aftermath of the mutiny, the weekly intelligence summary issued on the 25th of March 1946 admitted that the Indian Army, Navy and Air Force units were no longer trustworthy. It was decided that if wide-scale public unrest took shape, the armed forces, including the Air Force, could not be relied upon to support counterinsurgency operations as they had been during the Quit India movement in 1942. Reflecting on the factors that guided the British decision to relinquish the Raj in India, Clement Attlee, the then British Prime Minister, cited several reasons, the most important of which were the INA activities of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, which weakened the Indian Army, and the Royal Indian Navy mutiny that made the British realise that the Indian armed forces could no longer be trusted to prop up the Raj. But there is a little backstory to the armed struggle of the INA, as Peter Wardfey, author of The Forgotten Army, has pointed out. For this we need to go to the northern Indian state of Punjab, home to many Indian nationalists and freedom fighters. Following the Amritsar massacre in 1919, Sikh political leaders organised peaceful protests to recover their shrines from British-appointed priests. At Nankana, they were set upon by hired thugs and massacred. The uproar that followed, which lasted several years and threw up a terrorist wing of the Sikh movement known as the Babar movement, ranged a large part of the Sikh community against the British, partly because the British were insensitive to the Sikh temple issue and tended to side with the priests, partly because many of the Babars had links with the Gaddar movement, and during the First World War, that organisation had tried to raise the Punjab against British rule. In 1913, a growing number of migrants from Punjab formed the Gaddar Party in San Francisco, to raise an army to overthrow British colonial rule in India. The Gaddar Party's main support came from Sikh peasants who had begun to migrate from Punjab in the 1890s. Moving east to Hong Kong and further east to the United States and Canada in search of better wages, these men worked as labourers in the Pacific Northwest. During the slump of 1907, Sikhs in Canada found themselves the butt of racial prejudice. The Sikhs were vilified as ragheads, and they found themselves at the storm centre of racial tensions that occasionally flared into violence. Stung by their bitter experiences with prejudice and bigotry, disheartened by the British government's failure to assist with problems of immigration to Canada, harboring a persecuted immigrant's need to reaffirm his cultural identity, the Sikhs in California and the other coastal states were primed to be receptive to the idea of fighting a revolutionary struggle for India's freedom. In the early months of World War I, an ambitious attempt to free their country was made by Indians living overseas, particularly in the United States and Canada. Although the overwhelming majority of the Gaddarites were Sikhs, and the centers of revolutionary activity were the Sikh temples in Canada, the United States, Shanghai, Hong Kong and Singapore, there were also leaders from other organizations and communities. The party organized thousands of Sikhs to return to India with the purpose of launching armed revolts and mutinies among Indian soldiers in the British colonial army. They tried hard to mobilize the people and infiltrate into various units of the armed forces, but the British spies outmaneuvered them. The major weakness of the Gaddar Party was its exceptionally poor sense of secrecy, which made it an easy target for British imperialism, armed as the latter was with the knowledge of the revolutionaries' plans. not to say a monstrous police and military machine for suppression of the Indian people. Following their arrests, they were tried in camera in a series of conspiracy trials. Many were sentenced to death and many others imprisoned for life, or court-martialed. But they remained steadfast in their commitment, and continued to struggle first for independence and thereafter for true social, cultural, economic and political freedom. They preferred a decentralization of Indian states on the same model as the American Republic. The Babar militants in the early 1920s drew strength and inspiration from the Gadar movement, and rejected the non-violent struggle of the Sikh temple reformers. These events coincided with Mahatma Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. The campaign was at its peak in 1922, but Gandhi's abrupt decision to call off the movement following violent scenes in Uttar Pradesh left many Indians disillusioned with non-violence. Since the arrival of the Simon Commission in 1928, the temperature of Indian politics had risen noticeably. Appointed to consider what should follow the first small measure of self-government granted by the Government of India Act, the Simon Commission had advertised its emptiness and fatuity by failing to include a single Indian. It was received everywhere with black flags and work stoppages. The authorities responded with baton charges. At Lahore, the elderly, Lala Lajpat Rai was struck across the chest, and subsequently died. 2 months later, the English police officer thought responsible for that outrage was shot dead. This was alleged to be the work of a certain Bhagat Singh, who some months later still entered the public gallery of the Central Legislative Assembly at Delhi accompanied by a companion, scattered leaflets, and tossed a couple of bombs, not to kill, the leaflets explained, but to make the deaf hear. The two were arrested. Searches uncovered several clandestine bomb factories. Bhagat Singh became the central figure in what came to be known as the Lahore conspiracy case. In September 1929, one of the accused died after a long hunger strike. His funeral procession drew angry demonstrators by the thousands. Nor did the violence cease, for in December, shortly before the Congress assembled at Lahore for its annual session, the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, narrowly escaped death when a bomb exploded under his special train. This last affair confronted the Congress session with the question Bhagat Singh had been trying to raise, the question that regularly divided the independence movement. Should patriots pursue the path of non-violence? Or should they turn to direct action? When Gandhi asked the delegates to express their relief at the Viceroy's escape, he was hotly opposed, and though his motion passed, it passed narrowly. For the moment at least, Congress party was set on a militant course. In 1928, at the annual session held that year in Calcutta, it had been agreed that if India was not granted dominion status by the end of 1929, civil disobedience, which Gandhi had brought the country to the brink of 6 years before, would begin in earnest. Now a resolution framed by Gandhi himself, and adopted, announced civil disobedience as soon as a time and an appropriate tactic could be determined. Dominion status would no longer suffice. India must have complete independence, and she must have it at once. Lahore was galvanized. The consequence was predictable. The dramatic steps that followed the Lahore session, the unfurling at midnight on the 31st of December, 1929, of the green, white, and saffron flag, the simultaneous reading all over India on January 26, now Republic Day, of the Declaration of Independence, the mass resignations of Congress legislators, Gandhi's march to the sea to pick up salt, are all generally remembered in this period. But the Lahore conspiracy case was a different matter. Bhagat Singh had been the leader of the youth movement in the Punjab. The little act of bravado on the public gallery of the Legislative Assembly, the arrests on charges of plotting violence against the British, gave terrorists an appeal it had not had before. In many parts of India Bhagat Singh was as well known as the Mahatma himself. Schoolboys longed to imitate him. Prem Sehgal, a veteran of the INA, was no exception. According to him, young boys who wished to be enlisted in the youth movement were asked to pledge their commitment to the cause of freedom by holding their elbow over a candle flame and letting the flesh burn. This initiation ritual was started by Bhagat Singh himself. Lahore was caught up in the climax of the conspiracy case. Appeals to the viceroy had failed to stay the sentence passed upon Bhagat Singh. Early one morning, a friend of Prem's family whose bungalow adjoined the central jail heard commotion and shouting, guessed that Bhagat Singh and his companions were being hanged, and gave the alarm. Young Congress party members surprised a police van leaving the jail compound, followed it into the country, saw several bodies taken out and burned, and brought the remains back. Lahore awoke. A procession miles long carried the remains to the banks of the Ravi. Tension gripped the city, tension so acute that for 24 hours the police kept deliberately out of sight. This was in March 1931. Released from the prison term that followed close on his march to the sea, Gandhi had gone to Delhi. There he closeted himself with Lord Irwin, and at the end of a series of talks agreed to discontinue civil disobedience if the government would release all political prisoners and make certain other concessions. These did not include the abolition of the salt monopoly. How could this be consonant with complete independence? A week after Bhagat Singh and his companions died as national martyrs, a sullen and divided Congress meeting in annual session at Karachi reluctantly ratified the Delhi Pact. By the end of 1931, Gandhi had changed course again and once more threatened civil disobedience. But Irwin was gone, and this time the government struck so swiftly, arresting every congressman of consequence, seizing funds and proscribing sympathetic organizations, that the second round of civil disobedience never got started. For 2 years the Congress barely functioned and failed to achieve any positive outcome. An analysis of the late 1920s and early 1930s could become the basis for proposing that in this period, there were two serious ideological contenders for leadership of India's national movement. One was Gandhiism, the other was what may fairly be termed Bhagat Singhism. Gandhiism and Bhagat Singhism should not be reduced to the polarity of non-violence versus violence. Gandhiism was a perspective of minimal socio-economic transformation as a replacement of British imperial rule. It was focused on transfer of political power. There is ample historical evidence to show that Gandhi was even willing to accept a subordinate dominion status for India under the broad structure of imperial rule. His compromising with British imperialism faced sharp criticism from Subhas Chandra Bose within the Congress. A part of the reason for his compromising stance towards British imperialism was the serious involvement of the top layers of India's capitalist class in the influencing of, if not making of, the Gandhian and Congress perspective. Gandhi's strength was his unflinching, even arrogant, commitment to non-violence and what he considered to be truth. Gandhi's weakness was his utter lack of understanding of the process of global capital accumulation and imperialism and the insertion of India into the global capitalist framework. Gandhi's strength was in understanding the deep impact of Hinduism, or at least a version of it, on the consciousness of the majority Hindu population in the country. This led him to coin slogans such as Ram Raj, which resonated with the vast majority of the Hindu population. In this strength also lay his weakness. It was his alienation of Muslims which resulted eventually in the creation of Pakistan, and amongst the Sikhs his influence dwindled after his arrogant characterization of Guru Gobind Singh as a misguided leader. Proximity to Hindus allowed Gandhi to feel the pulse of India's majority, but that also resulted in an overall conservative orientation to his ideas and actions. In contrast with these strengths and weaknesses of Gandhi, Bhagat Singh and his comrades were strong in understanding the logic of the world capitalist economy but were weak in building an organizational structure in comparison with Gandhi's widespread Congress party organization. The strength of their mass popularity was not matched by the quality of their organizational structure. In terms of their popularity, They were popular not only with the majority Hindu population but also with the Muslims and the Sikhs. There was indeed a tinge of Hinduism in their political language, but it was more than adequately compensated for by their non-religious and analytical discourse. Their political radicalism was a product of their analytical strength in understanding the class structure of colonialism. Their vision was not a replacement of the rule of the white capitalist class by the Indian capitalist class, it was a vision of replacement of the rule of capital by the rule of labor. Had Bhagat Singh not been hanged in 1931, there would have been a serious contest between the Gandhi-led Congress vision and the Bhagat Singh-led socialist vision. Bhagat Singh also had the advantage over the Indian communists that his radicalism was popularly seen as homegrown and rooted. With Bhagat Singh in the leadership position of the Indian socialist tradition, he would have become the rallying force against the Gandhi-led Congress's pro-capitalist vision. Halfway through the Second World War there appeared quite unexpectedly in South Asia an army, an Indian army, an adored and indomitable leader by training, not a military man at all, an army that, using Malaya as a base, Burma as a launching pad, and Japan as a helpmate, tried, even as the war in that part of the world was drawing to a close, to throw the British out of India. Particularly outside India, in Europe and North America, though for us it is a matter less, perhaps, of forgetting than of preferring not to know. We have never wanted to be told that independence was something many Indians thought they could obtain only by fighting. We have never been anxious to admit it was reasonable of Indians to take up arms against the British. And we certainly have not wanted to admit that it was reasonable of them to do so in wartime, at a moment of great difficulty and peril for Britain elsewhere in the world. These admissions are painful. To make them is to concede the possibility that when the Second World War began, a sovereign and independent India was not, as we had supposed, safely in sight. That, in turn, obliges us to recast our image of India in its British period. It is an exercise we are not keen to undertake. But does this notion fit what actually occurred under the Raj? Most of us are familiar with Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Nehru. Indeed, the British have put them into their Dictionary of National Biography along with several Maharajas. We admire the elegance and breeding of the Brahmin. We applaud the saintliness and shrewdness of the Mahatma. We even look to both for exemplary behavior under all manner of hard knocks, and get it. We attend Sir Richard Attenborough's cinematic life of Gandhi expecting to be touched and horrified by the police brutalities their non-resistance will provoke, and are. But very few of us are able to handle Chandra Bose, Captain Mohan Singh or Bhagat Singh. Censored out of the news when alive, painted like Trotsky out of the picture when dead, these men nevertheless existed. This documentary is a humble tribute to these men whose invaluable contribution to the Indian independence struggle is often ignored or dismissed as insignificant in the pages of history. British decision to relinquish the Raj in India. Clement Attlee, the then British Prime Minister, cited several reasons, the most important of which were the INA activities of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, which weakened the Indian Army, and the Royal Indian Navy mutiny that made the British realise that the Indian armed forces could no longer be trusted to prop up the Raj. But there is a little backstory to the armed struggle. The 5th of March 1946 admitted that the Indian Army, Navy and Air Force units were no longer trustworthy. It was decided that if wide-scale public unrest took shape, the armed forces, including the Air Force, could not be relied upon to support counterinsurgency operations as they had been during the Quit India movement in 1942. Reflecting on the factors that guided the INA, soldiers were brought to trial on treason charges. When news of the trial reached other Indians, there was nationwide discontent. And even worse for the British, mutiny broke out in the Royal Indian Navy in February 1946. The Navy mutiny was followed up by another among the ground crew in the Royal Indian Air Force. In the aftermath of the mutiny, The weekly intelligence summary issued on the 20th of the INA, as Peter Wardfee, author of The Forgotten Army, has pointed out. For this we need to go to the northern Indian state of Punjab, home to many Indian nationalists and freedom fighters. Following the Amritsar massacre in 1919, Sikh political leaders organized peaceful protests to recover their shrines from British-appointed priests. At Nankana, they were set upon. The following documentary is dedicated to the heroes of a formidable army, an army of Indian prisoners of war and civilians who fought a courageous battle against British colonial rule during the Second World War. Outnumbered and outgunned on the battlefield, the Indian National Army, or INA as it was called, was defeated and forced to surrender. At the conclusion of the war, some of the captured